By this point, by 1900, the United States has a formidable overseas territorial empire. It has colonies, a lot of people live in them. And that's not something that we always explore at length. I think, and one of the reasons, frankly, I think is maps. You know, I grew up in Pennsylvania, and nowhere did I really see a map that showed me the full territorial extent of the United States. What I was used to seeing growing up was maps that showed you the logo map, and then that had boxes, but just two boxes for 8 islands making up Hawaii, and a box for Alaska. And usually the box for Alaska was significantly shrunk down because Alaska is actually huge.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to your library. I'm David Leonard, BPL President and host of this series, The Arc of History, Contested Perspectives. I am coming to you live from the Bates Hall Reading Room at the Central Library in Copley Square, a space that many use for reading, research, education, and the pursuit of knowledge. Thank you for joining us virtually tonight. Our program this evening is presented in conjunction with the Lowell Institute, a longtime sponsor of lectures and conversations, as well as our production partners at the GBH Forum Network. Our book sponsor tonight is Trident Bookstores, so to get a copy for yourselves of the book under discussion, please visit their website. We'll be posting links throughout the program in chat. And tonight's program is also co-hosted by both the Boston Public Library and the Leventhal Map and Education Center at the Boston Public Library. And now to introduce the Leventhal Map and Education Center and our very special guest for the evening, I would like to invite to the microphone the Curator of Maps and Director of Geographic Scholarship, Garrett Dash Nelson. Garrett, please tell us what you are looking most forward to tonight and tell us about the center and our guest.
Thanks again, David. To say I'm unfortunately not in as beautiful and important a civic space as you are, but I'm glad to be here just the same. My name is Garrett Nelson. I am the Curator of Maps and the Director of Geographic Scholarship at the Leventhal Map and Education Center. And it's a pleasure to welcome Daniel Immerwahr here this evening. Or since the topic of our discussion is a much wider geographic perspective than just our own little slice of the globe, it's a pleasure to welcome here this morning or afternoon or middle of the night or whatever time of day it is, wherever you happen to be on the globe as you're listening. Daniel's a professor of history at Northwestern University in Illinois. He's the author of numerous articles and 2 books, Thinking Small, The United States and the Lure of Community Development, which won the Merle Curdy Prize in Intellectual History, and the book that you'll hear about tonight, How to Hide an Empire, A History of the Greater United States. Daniel's historical work is full of a striking array of sources, from diplomatic telegrams to Donald Duck cartoons, from manuscripts to maps. And by paying careful attention to the geography of history, Daniel treats these maps not just as reference materials to show where things were, but rather as documents that lead us to consider how issues like political struggle, group representation, and global development are shaped by places, borders, and connections across space and time. This attitude towards maps is one we share at the Leventhal Center, where we not only care for the BPL's 250,000 geographic objects, but put them to work to explore themes from social justice to the American Revolution. Now, Daniel's event tonight had originally been planned for last March in the closing month of our year-long exhibition, America Transformed, which looked at the United States of the 19th century and concluded with the era of Greater United States maps that became popular as the country took on an imperial posture in the decade after the Spanish-American War. So although we've had to delay this much awaited talk by more than 6 months, it just so happens that our new exhibition, Bending Lines, Maps and Data from Distortion to Deception, also touches on topics that Daniel discusses in How to Hide an Empire, including the complicated relationship between national borders and citizenship. Both of these exhibitions are available in digital form, together with many other teaching and research resources on our website at leventhalmap.org. Now, in our program today, Daniel will begin by offering a short interpretation of his work on the US's global geography. And then David Leonard will join us again for a wide-ranging conversation. After that, we welcome questions from the audience. You can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. It looks like two word bubbles to send questions for David and for Daniel and for the group. On behalf of the Leventhal Center, the BPL, the Lowell Institute, and GBH, please join me in welcoming Daniel Immerwahr.
Hi, thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'd like to just talk for a second to tell you a little bit about the book I've written and the perspective that inspired it. And to do that, I will share my screen so we can look at some maps. I think if you were to ask someone to envision the United States as a map, to map it in their heads, I think that most people would come up with a picture, a familiar picture, and the picture would probably be this one. This is the contiguous United States. People from Alaska call it the lower 48. And the political scientist and anthropologist Benedict Anderson had a name for this. He called it the logo map, meaning, you know, if the country had a logo, it might be this. And he's not entirely wrong about that. But what interests me about the logo map and what I want to talk to you about today is a fact that we don't really explore a lot, which is that the logo map isn't actually a terrific map of the United States. And there are a few reasons why that's true. One reason, which any historian of the United States will tell you, is that this didn't always used to be the shape of the country. In fact, the United States started off significantly smaller and, you know, extending its borders basically, you know, from Canada, where it is now Canada, to what is now Florida, and only to the Mississippi. And it was only through a process of purchasing land, fighting wars, dispossessing indigenous peoples that the United States came to take on that familiar shape that we know. In fact, it took from the birth of the country until 1854, when that final sliver of land between the United States and what is now Mexico was taken, the Gadsden Purchase. So until 1854, before the United States took on that familiar profile, before it came to resemble the logo map. But here's the thing. Once the United States got those borders that we all kind of know, that are sort of emblazoned in our minds, it didn't hold them for very long. In fact, there are only 3 years of US history where that's the right map. There are 3 years in the United States' entire history where that's an accurate map of the country. And the reason is that after acquiring that familiar profile, filling that out, it started expanding again and taking new lands. So in fact, these are the 3 years, in case you're curious, the 3 years where that's the map of the United States. So what happened? First of all, starting in 1857, the United States acquired a series of uninhabited islands known as the Guano Islands for the nitrate-rich fertilizer that was hoped to be on them. It acquired, when I say a series of them, I mean almost 100, 94 islands starting in 1857, and the bulk of them were acquired right around that time, but extending into 1902. So here's a map I made showing you just all these little dots that are technically part of the United States in the late 19th century. And these are uninhabited, and geographically they're quite small, but they prefigure something much larger, which is that the United States keeps expanding. In 1867, it purchases Alaska from Russia, so that's an enormous amount of land. And then in 1898, the United States enters a war that Spain is already fighting against its own colonies. So Spain is experiencing and undergoing a colonial rebellion. The Spanish are fighting back, an attempt to preserve their colonial position, and are losing. And the United States enters this war on the side of the rebels against the Spanish Empire, but oddly finishes the war not by securing what the rebels want, which is independence from Spain, but rather by colonizing 3 of the Spanish colonies, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam, and then in a sort of fit of imperial enthusiasm at the same time, taking the non-Spanish lands of Hawaii and American Samoa, at the same time occupying Cuba. By this point, by 1900, the United States has a formidable overseas territorial empire. It has colonies, a lot of people live in them, and that's not something that we always explore at length, I think, and one of the reasons, frankly, I think, is maps. You know, I grew up in Pennsylvania, and nowhere did I really see a map that showed me the full territorial extent of the United States. What I was used to seeing growing up was maps that showed you the logo map, and then that had boxes, but just two boxes for 8 islands making up Hawaii, and a box for Alaska. And usually the box for Alaska was significantly shrunk down because Alaska is actually huge. To give you some sense of it, here's a map of the United States made by an Alaskan. Cartographic revenge, if you will. So it shows you all of the spaces that I just described, Alaska, Hawaii, and the logo map, but it shows them from an Alaskan perspective, where Alaska is big and it's shown in intricate cartographic detail. The coastline is finely rendered, and then what Alaskans call the lower 48, the logo map, is just sort of a distended shape that no one really cares about, and is shown, not to scale, and kind of distorted in some ways. Actually, Hawaii is treated with much more care and cartographic concern in this map. So that just gives you a sense of the issue. So I decided that I wanted to make a map of the United States, and the reason I wanted to make one is that I couldn't find a lot of maps that showed the United States as I wanted to see it. So I was curious, what would it look like if you showed the United States not like I was used to seeing it, just the logo map, but all of the territory that's annexed to the United States? And what if you showed all that territory not shrunken down as Alaska often is, but to scale? So here's my version of not the logo map, but what some people at the turn of the century called the Greater United States. This is from 1940, which is at the height of the United States' imperial sort of extension. This is when it has the most colonies. And what it shows you is the inhabited parts of the United States are all shown to scale. So reading right to left, you see the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, then Hawaii, the Long Island chain, the Philippines next to it, American Samoa, Guam, Alaska's up above them. And then I've shown you in the lower right and lower left clusters that are the uninhabited islands, including mainly the Guano Islands. I've shown them larger than they actually are, just so that they appear on the map, because otherwise they sort of wink out of existence. So one thing I want you to notice about this map, or one thing I noticed about this map, is, gosh, Alaska really is big. In fact, if you took Alaska and you superimposed it on the logo map, it would stretch from coast to coast. Alaskans are, in fact, quite proud of this fact and fully aware of it. Philippines is quite large as well. Hawaii, too, pay attention. It's not just the 8 islands that are normally shown. Actually, the entire Hawaiian island chain, if you were to get that whole thing and also superimpose it on the logo map, it almost would stretch nearly from coast to coast. And when you look at a map like this, you realize that the way the words that we use haven't quite been right. So I grew up referring to the logo map as the United States. What does the United States looks like? It looks like the logo map. You see here, and you look at this map here, and you realize, no, that's not the whole of the United States. That's part of the United States. It's a big part, it's an important part, it's a populous part, but it's not the entirety. So what do you call it? I didn't really have a word for it. I learned a word from people who live in the overseas territories of the United States. There are different vocabularies, but many of them call it the mainland. That's right. So it's part of the United States. It's the mainland. And it's not just the geography that I want to draw your attention to. Here's the US Census from the same year showing you the count of who lives in the overseas territories. And what you'll see is that the territories are varying sizes. The Philippines is quite large. This is pretty common in empires. The British Empire and India, which made up quite a large part of its bulk. The Dutch had what is today Indonesia. So the Philippines, as the United States, is a very large colony. But it also has some, quite seriously substantial ones in population size. Puerto Rico, Hawaii, Alaska. If you add up the entire colonial population of the United States, everyone who's living in the United States' overseas territories, we're talking about nearly 19 million people, which means that if you live in the United States, the whole United States, not just the logo map, in 1940, there's a 1 in 8 chance that you are colonized, that you live in one of the overseas territories. And for perspective, that means that if you live in the United States in 1940, you are more likely to be colonized than you are to be an African American. That's how many people live in the US overseas territories. And you're also more likely to be colonized than you are to be an immigrant. That's how many colonized people there are in the United States. As you're probably aware, the United States no longer has the Philippines as an overseas territory. In 1946, on July 4th, it became independent, so it is now an independent country. Hawaii and Alaska, which were territories of the United States, overseas territories, in 1959, in close succession, became states. So in that sense, the overseas territory map has shrunk. There are fewer places that are overseas territories that aren't states of the United States. But at the same time, the United States has grown in another way, claiming not large colonies, but a number of small military bases over which it claims jurisdiction. So places that it can use even if it doesn't claim full sovereignty over, but often these are places where the US flag flies, and to some degree US law is the governing law. When I say there are some places like this, actually there are, we think, nearly 800 places where the United States, foreign places where the United States has overseas military bases. This is a map I made that shows some of them. So the task that I tried to accomplish in the book I've written, How to Hide an Empire, was to show the United States and tell the history of the United States, not the way I learned it, where it was just the history of the mainland, but the history of the entire thing, the history of the greater United States. And as I try to show in that book, when you take that whole history as your unit of analysis, when you look at all of these spaces, not just Pennsylvania, Ohio, Kansas, Montana, US history comes out differently, and it's really interesting how it does. So I hope we can get into some of that in the conversation.
Daniel, thanks so much for that amazing introduction to our topic tonight. I've been trying to think about how to situate the conversation, and it really seems like what we're doing is living at this intersection of politics, history, and geography, really. And that's what I'm looking forward to unpacking with you a little bit more tonight based upon the book. But maybe I could ask just a couple of questions about your interest before we go into the book itself. And you are a historian. That is your primary identity in this context as a scholar, as I understand it. And so, is it common for historians to use maps in this way? Is this something that you've always done, or is it a recent discovery?
No, it wasn't. I mean, it wasn't something that I was trained to do, and it wasn't something that a lot of people around me were doing, and I wasn't ready for it. So I realized as I started doing this research that the maps in my head were wrong, and that I would have to do something about that. And I had a really interesting conversation with a wonderful cartographer who was really influential on me, a man named Bill Rankin, who's both a cartographer and a professor of history at Yale. And he said, you know, it's so tempting to outsource the maps, right? Just to hire someone to make maps. But if you do that, you won't learn how to speak the language of maps, and it won't even occur to you what things to ask for. So it's worth the time. And so I decided that one of the things I'd have to do in order to write this book would be to learn how to make maps myself. And he was entirely right, is once you are able to do it, then you find yourself thinking spatially and cartographically, and then you find yourself asking questions or having little eureka moments that you might not have otherwise had.
Would you mind sharing what brought you to this topic first? I could have imagined that you start with a map first and it leads to a whole series of questions, or you're interested in a topic and then you go in search of the research to see where that leads you.
Yeah, the thing that brought me to it was really, honestly, sheer stupidity on my part, or at least ignorance. I'd been teaching U.S. history for quite some time, and teaching it in the normal way that is enjoined by our textbooks. And so, I'd talk a little bit about the Philippines and Puerto Rico in the one class that I gave about 1898, and then they sort of vanished as if they were no longer part of the United States. And I was, happy to go on teaching that way. So when I taught the Depression, I, absolutely said nothing about Guam or the Philippines, et cetera. And it wasn't until I traveled to Manila for something entirely unrelated, for research, but entirely unrelated research. And I just took a gander and looked at the place that it suddenly dawned on me that I'd been really kind of crucially misunderstanding my own country and the country of which I was a historian. What I saw in Manila was, it was just so obvious that this place had been part of the United States and been colonized by the United States. I saw streets that were named after US presidents. When I was taking transit, I would take jeepneys, which are repurposed US Army Jeeps. And I talked to people who spoke English, and some of whom spoke English with pretty much the same accent that I have. And, you do that for a little bit and it just kind of becomes obvious. I had known in an intellectual way that the Philippines had once been a territory of the United States, but I hadn't really thought through the implications of that. So it felt like the difference between reading the lyrics and hearing the music. And then, once I had that, then I scurried back to California and I sort of started reading up more up on Philippine history. And I thought, I probably need to know what to say about Hawaii too. And then, the whole thing just kind of tumbled out. I realized that I'd just been doing US history in some ways with the wrong unit of analysis. US history for me had always been the history of the US mainland, and I never realized that that's what I was implicitly doing. And so once that opened up, I realized there were all kinds of things you could say.
Because I think, when we think of the origin of the U.S., and I think what our conversation is also about is what is the United States thought of from a territorial or land point of view. We think about 1607 or 1620 as one point of departure. We understand the 1776 as another. But it seems even from dipping into the book that the concept of the U.S. is actually much more fluid than even a sequence of dates would tell you.
That's right. So, in some ways, I pose this to you as I realized that I was getting the where of the United States wrong, that I literally had located it incorrectly on a map. But once you alter your sense of where, you also change your sense of what. And it's not just that we can do this as readers and writers and historians. People at the time, people who were living in the US mainland at 1898. Now, that's not the first moment that the United States gained territories or went overseas, but nevertheless, it was a really vivid and just a kind of clock cleaning sort of moment intellectually for a lot of people. A lot of people in the US mainland said to themselves and to others, we've been thinking about this country as a republic, and it's quite clearly not a republic. We are not expecting the Philippines to be a state. We are not expecting Puerto Rico to join the Union. We are not, these territories are not embryonic states. They're just colonies. And we need to acknowledge and perhaps even celebrate the fact in some of their views that the United States is an empire. It's transparent. It's like the British Empire. And one of the great kind of fallouts from that intellectual moment is they started remapping, very briefly, but enthusiastically remapping the country and, showing the country with lots of insets, so you'd see the Philippines, you'd see, some of these small islands. And it was also a moment when they started searching for new names of the country. The common thing to do in the 19th century had been to refer to the United States of America. That's 10 syllables. So they usually would use a shorthand like the United States, the Union, or the Republic. And then right after 1898, you see writers starting to say, none of those nicknames really work because it's not a union. Union is like people voluntarily entering into as a marriage. It's not really that. It's not a republic. And it's not a union of states. So they looked for other kind of modifiers, the greater United States, the Imperial Republic. And the thing that happened is that they started using the term America a lot more, really distinctly right at this moment. And of course it caught on. That's how that's the nickname that we use for the country today. But I think a lot of that had to do with a kind of nagging sense that United States wasn't quite the right descriptor for this country as people could now understand it.
I do want to turn to the book because I imagine that with all of these topics, and there are questions already coming in that we'll need to get to, we could probably go for quite a while tonight. There are 2 points of departure in the book that I want to ask you about. One, which we'll start with, is why you picked the Daniel Boone sort of character as coming on the scene as a first point of departure. And then the second one is really to do with some of the World War II events and the entry of the U.S. into World War II because of Pearl Harbor. But let's start with Daniel Boone, and why is that a seminal point of departure for part of the work?
Yeah, not for the reasons that you'd think. I think Daniel Boone figures in the national mythology as just someone who's advancing the country's mission. It was an expanding country. He was a frontier guy, and put 2 and 2 together. So he's like the astronaut of the 18th century or something like that. But that's not how he was seen. What was fascinating to me was so Boone is indeed one of the first white claimants to lands west of the Appalachians and tries to move a number of white people out there where they hadn't moved before, because that land is controlled by a number of Indian polities. And in this case, Shawnees control the land that he's trying to squat on, right, to steal. And what's interesting about that is that you would think, or I would have thought, that he would do this with the full support of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, all hoping to see their country expand. But that's in fact entirely false. He was quite popular in Europe. He was well known in Europe, and all kinds of Enlightenment philosophers and romantic intellectuals were just fascinated by this white man living in the woods as a kind of semi-savage. But the leaders of the country on the East Coast were actually actively hostile to Boone. And the reason they were actively hostile is that they didn't feel comfortable with rapid expansion in the way that we imagine them having felt comfortable with it. They were much more interested in, I mean, partly because Indian wars were so expensive and difficult for the weak United States to fight, and Indian polities were in fact quite strong at the time. But one of the payoffs of that is that basically the founders of the United States didn't just define a system that was about wall-to-wall carpeting of states, partly because they were so nervous about what was happening on the western fringe of their small country, or relatively small country compared to now. They devised this system where on the East Coast you'd have states that were self-governing and part of a larger federation, the United States. And in the West, there would be these things called territories, which were under the tight control of the East. We kind of forget that fact, but actually there's a lot of political suspicion in the East of these territories in the West, in the same way that there was of Boone. He's in some ways, it kind of models exactly, why and how, to what degree Eastern elites just, really were made nervous by folks like Boone. But the effect is that despite the title of the country, the United States, at no point in its history has it ever been a union of states. It's always been, at least since the treaty ratifying its independence from Britain happened, it's always been a collection of states and territories. And a lot of that has to do with the suspicion of Boone and men like Boone.
I mean, it is interesting that even at that point in time, you have this notion of core land and a core identity, core political identity, but then other things called territories. And as we will learn, I think, if you read the book, lots of other components that make up what you end up referring to as the greater United States in terms of that 1940 analysis of land. So I think this is important, and it wasn't out of respect for the native peoples or any concern about whether the territory was up for grabs either.
I mean, it's not out of respect in the sense that we might use the term. It is out of a kind of military respect, out of a realization that it is hard for the United States at this time to make effective land claims far to the west. And people like Boone are dragging state governments into wars that they can't really afford to fight and might lose.
So let's move forward, because we're going to hop around a bit, and we won't go chapter by chapter, I promise you. That's what reading the book is for.
We'll skip some of them.
Only out of a sense of time, for sure. But World War II, so Pearl Harbor occurs. And what was fascinating to me was to look at your analysis of leadership at the time, trying to decide how to talk about this in terms of the Philippines, Hawaii. Where was this attack actually taking place? Would you talk to us just a little bit about what you found as you looked at the language that was used and what the research led you to understand?
Yeah, and this is another question of how do we conceptually map things? Yeah. We have this term, Pearl Harbor, that names the event. They did not have that term. It took a while. I mean, it took days, not weeks, not months, not years, but it took a little bit of time for newspaper editors, for politicians to learn to say, yesterday, the date which will live in infamy, the Japanese did Pearl Harbor. And, you can remember that kind of lexical confusion from 9/11. Now we have a term, 9/11, but right after that, there was no term. And people were trying to figure out, how do you headline the newspaper? What do you say happened? And it turns out a lot of different things happen. And are they all part of the same event, or do we privilege one part of them? In the case of 9/11, it has now become 9/11. That's when the World Trade Center fell, when the towers fell. But at the time, how important is the Pentagon? Is that really the important target? It took a while for people to kind of settle on a narrative, and that is absolutely true of Pearl Harbor as well, because Pearl Harbor, the U.S. naval facility in Hawaii, was not the only place that the Japanese attacked. Within a matter of hours, Japan had attacked Hawaii. It had attacked the uninhabited, so there's no indigenous population, but occupied, and thousands of people were there, territory of Wake Island, which the United States also had, the U.S. inhabited territory of Guam, the largest colony the United States has ever held, the Philippines, as well as Hong Kong, that's a British territory, Malaya, that's a British territory, and the independent kingdom of Thailand. So how do you talk about that? And the day of, newspaper editors are saying things like the Japanese attack Guam in the Philippines, or Japanese attack Hawaii in the Philippines. And you see this kind of geographic uncertainty about what locales to privilege. And I think what eventually happens, in FDR's famous Date Which Will Live in Infamy speech has a lot to do with this, is that US leaders really focus on Hawaii and almost make it to the point where right now, a lot of people don't even know the Philippines was attacked as part of that same attack. And the reason is that Hawaii was a territory, not a state. But unlike the other territories that were hit, Hawaii had a significantly larger white population and seemed in some eyes to be possibly on the road to statehood, and in the way that the Philippines wasn't. So if FDR wanted to be able to say the Japanese attacked the United States of America, he had reason to be concerned. And I think he was concerned that if he said, Japanese hit the Philippines, they've attacked the United States of America, his audience might say, is the Philippines really the United States of America? Does it really count? Is that really America? He thought Hawaii was a better bet, so he really doubled down on Hawaii. And even still, in his speech, he refers to it, the American place. He really tells you how American Hawaii is in that speech, just so you won't miss the message.
And is this a racial narrative, or is this a distance narrative, or some sort of something else, or a little of all of that together?
Yeah, I mean, it is true that Hawaii is geographically closer to the U.S. mainland than the other places, but my strong sense is that it's a racial narrative. The magic dust that turns territories into states or parts of the United States, throughout the 19th century and the early 20th century is white settlement. That's built into some of the laws as the United States is expanding in the 18th and 19th century, but it's just a persistent pattern, and it becomes part of the thinking about what places are American and what places aren't is literally just how many white people are in them.
And let's stay with this concept of statehood within this greater set of lands that we're talking about. So 58, 59, we have Alaska and Hawaii then on the path to and became states. Why them, not other places? And we end up with this very strange, I think, different categorizations of different territories or different lands, which we still live with today. So what's going on there?
Yeah, so the United States still has 5 inhabited territories, millions of people live in them, but Alaska and Hawaii became states. And they are the only overseas territories that became states. So the question is, what happened? The first thing to recognize, it was far from obvious that they would be states, partly because of their large non-white populations, partly because of their non-contiguity from the US mainland. And it took a lot to make them states. It took partly Cold War pressures. So after the Philippines had been given independence, after Puerto Rico was given a nebulous new status that technically, by some arguments, might be able to make it no longer a colony, Hawaii and Alaska were embarrassingly still colonies of the United States. And the Soviet Union took great glee in pointing this out over and over again during the Cold War. So upgrading Hawaii and Alaska to states was a way of sort of the United States gaining some legitimacy and distancing itself from at least formal empire, which meant a lot in Asia, where it was trying to get a lot of power. But in order to do that, and presidents had wanted to do that for quite some time for that reason, in order to do that, the politicians had to overcome racist resistance within Congress. So the defenders of Jim Crow were fully aware that if you admit Hawaii and Alaska as states, they are going to be votes for civil rights. So a part of the civil rights movement that we don't talk about is getting these non-fully white states admitted as states. Hawaii is really the first state that is admitted to the Union that is not admitted under the logic of white rule. That is not the criterion on which it's admitted, and that's a civil rights fight. Martin Luther King Jr. is very supportive of Hawaii. A lot of civil rights leaders look to Hawaii's racial makeup as a model for a new and better United States. And Jim Crow defenders like Strom Thurmond are dead set against it and threaten to filibuster.
Yet we also, I think, have a couple of examples, and there's one in the book about areas that didn't become states. So I'm thinking of part of Oklahoma, I think. Can you just tell us about what that part is?
Yeah, you kind of imagine that statehood is an automatic process, that once there's enough people, you just file the paperwork and you can be a state. I mean, that's the gist of what I was taught, at least, in high school and such. It's not true. It turns out that Congress has absolute authority over the territories and therefore absolute discretion over which territories get to be upgraded, and that there's a long history of places seeking statehood and not getting them. And so there's a lot of sort of colorful, things that tried to be states within the U.S. mainland that failed. So Lincoln, Montezuma, Deseret, and in the book I tell the story of a part of what is now Oklahoma that was inhabited, and the land was owned mainly by various Indian groups. And as they saw whites encroaching on their land and their loss of political power, they thought, okay, last ditch effort, let's just try to be a state, like a mainly Indian state. They called it Sequoia, after a Cherokee silversmith who would design these syllabaries to make Cherokee a written language. And they pushed for statehood. And Congress denied their application for statehood, and then instead admitted Oklahoma as with the boundaries it has today. And instead of admitting the smaller Sequoia, but instead of admitting the larger Oklahoma, the effect was to dilute the Indian population so that Oklahoma, when admitted, would be a white majority state.
Now, you mentioned boundaries, and this is one of my favorite naive questions to ask is, there are a lot of our states that have very straight lines as their borders, and I think you actually have an image of this to just unpack not just the borders of the U.S. as a whole at different points in time, but the interior borders between the states themselves.
Yeah, let's get into this. So, I tell my students this: if you look at a map and you see a straight border, you know that whoever drew that border was nowhere near the place, right? It's usually empire that produces straight lines on maps. So Central Africa, for example, there's a lot of straight line borders, and those are basically drawn by Europeans in Berlin or at some other European locale as European politicians are dividing up Africa. So interestingly, that's also true of the United States. So you can see some states really have a lot of straight lines built into them, especially as you're looking at the middle of the country. And so this is another map I made. And the reason why I want to show you this on this map is that you can see the borders and you can see some of these just basically square states or rectangular states. But you can also see something else. This is a map of time to statehood. So how long it took land after it was annexed to the United States before it became a state. So first thing to notice is some of these places take a long time before they become states, over 75 years. There are 5 states here on the U.S. mainland that are parts of their U.S. territory for more than 75 years before they become states. Not surprisingly, they also tend to be the ones with straight-ish lines. And the reason for this is that Oklahoma is one of them, and I kind of walked you through that. These are places that have large native populations and therefore are held in a kind of territorial purgatory, are held as internal colonies, internal to the U.S. mainland, and are not allowed to be admitted as states until they have sufficient white population. So two things are happening at once, and it's not entirely a surprise that they happen together. The places that are mapped from afar are usually the places that are larger native populations, smaller white populations, and those are also the places that are held back as territories. Oklahoma is a territory of the United States for more than a century before it becomes a state, which means that Oklahoma is held as a colony of the United States longer than the French-held Indochina, which became Vietnam, and larger than the Belgians, including King Leopold, held the Congo. I mean, it's more than a century before Oklahoma gets to be a state.
Amazing. I have a couple more questions I want to pose for you, and then we're going to bring Garrett back and start going through some of the questions that have been submitted by those who put a question at registration or have lined one up for us tonight. I want to go all the way forward to North Marianas, which you talk about as sometimes it counts one way, sometimes it counts an entirely different way, depending on whether we're talking about territory or trade. So there's clearly an agenda going on here that's different than simply whether it's part of the country or not.
Yeah. So in the 90s, it came out that a lot of major US clothing manufacturers, J. Crew, Abercrombie and Fitch, et cetera, were having their clothing made on Saipan in the Northern Mariana Islands. And Saipan is not particularly close to where these clothes were mainly sold, which is the US mainland. And it's certainly not close from where the laborers were coming from, which is rural China and urban India. And so you had this question, why is clothing manufacturing taking place on Saipan? Also, Saipan is gorgeous. It seems like a weird place to put a lot of sweatshops. And the answer is that Saipan is part of the United States, but because it's a territory and what's legally called an unincorporated territory rather than a state, the Constitution doesn't fully extend to it. This is true of all the existing territories of the United States, which is why you can, for example, be born in American Samoa, and despite the fact that you are born in an American territory, it's in the title, you'll be born as a national, not a citizen, because the 14th Amendment doesn't apply. And federal law doesn't fully apply. So in Saipan, it was exempt from, or the federal minimum wage law didn't apply. OSHA regulations were extremely laxly enforced because the closest office was hundreds or I think over 1,000 miles away. And immigration restrictions that might have prevented guest workers from coming in from China and India were also didn't apply. So it had all of that, except that it also was part of the United States with respect to quotas, which at that point were governing the clothing trade. So despite all of that, the garments that were stitched on Saipan could nevertheless be made in the USA, which they were. They were technically made in the USA. And there was this big brouhaha in Congress as this came out, and a lot of people wanted to close one of the 5 loopholes that produced this situation. There was a lobbyist who kept pushing to keep it open. And whenever the Congress would consider it, he would sort of fly out everyone who was making the decision on the committee and have them scuba diving, in around Saipan. And his name was Jack Abramoff. He turned out to be one of the most notorious lobbyists ever. And when I discovered this, I thought, oh, this is amazing. What is Jack Abramoff doing in the Northern Mariana Islands? And it turns out that you think that as the most famous lobbyist at that point he was in the country, he would be representing Fortune 500 companies, but he wasn't. He was representing Guam, the Northern Mariana Islands. He represented the Philippines at one point. He represented Puerto Rico. He represented a number of tribal nations, Indian nations within the United States. And the reason he did is that he discovered something really powerful, which is that all of these places are places of legal anomaly. Because empire is a system where the laws don't apply equally in all places. Jack Abramoff discovered this and realized that the way to be Washington's sort of most impressive lobbyist was not to rep the big companies. It was to find the weird spaces where you could play all, kind of work all of the loopholes, which he did. I mean, that was his entire career, was doing this. And it just reminds you that you think that the United States is just one country legally and administratively. It's not. There are a lot of different spaces of exception within it. And Guantanamo Bay is another example. You can do things in Guantanamo Bay as the US military that you can't do in other spaces. And it's just another way of seeing how even small places like Saipan can be really important to US history because they're different kind of spaces where different sorts of things can happen.
Which leads you to consider the U.S., and this is the case in the book, as it is an empire with colonies, which in some ways where, at least in part, a couple of the very things that that the early founding fathers, early American founding fathers, in theory wanted to rebel against, and yet here we are with an empire and colonies, perhaps in quotes, perhaps not.
It's somewhat ironic in that the country is founded out of an anti-imperial revolt and on Republican principles. It nevertheless, from day one, has territories, and from the bulk of its history, has overseas territories. I don't know any word besides empire to describe that political system. I think in some ways, maybe that's not a surprise, right? Countries can shift; they grow bigger, they become empires. The weird thing about that, I think, in the case of the United States, is just a sense of denial about it. I mean, even referring to this as an empire is somewhat contentious, and I, get people who get sort of angered by this terminology. And other empires have just been empires and just announced that they are empires. Britain had a holiday called Empire Day to celebrate the fact that it was an empire, and the United States has no such thing. And in fact, it has a long culture of understanding itself as a republic, mapping itself with only the republic relevant parts on the map, and just in all kinds of ways that I tried to get at in the book, pushing its imperial aspects to the margin or even off the map entirely, so that for people on the mainland like me growing up, they became really hard to recognize.
And I think I was certainly taught that ancient empires were more about land than they were about politics or economies. Yet I think in our North Marianas and Saipan example, you're talking about it as clearly being about economic power as much as land power, and perhaps the two aren't possible to disassociate from each other at the end of the day.
If you look at the places where the United States controls on the map today that are outside of the states and the mainland, so not counting Hawaii and Alaska, but counting Puerto Rico and all the military bases, so everywhere over which the United States has jurisdiction, it is a land area that is smaller than Connecticut. So we are not talking about an enormous amount of land today, but nevertheless, we are talking about 800 or so spots, some of which large islands like Puerto Rico, but many of them just quite small dots on the map where the United States claims jurisdiction. Now you could think, just that's almost nothing. It's like in terms of acreage, just round that down to zero. It's effectively zero. But it turns out that those spots are really important to the United States. Some of them economically, some of them as spaces of exception, like Saipan, like Guantanamo Bay. But others of them militarily and strategically. It turns out, and I try to talk about this in the book, it has mattered enormously to the United States that it has a presence, jurisdiction all over the map. And the current state of US power is unimaginable without those 800 or so overseas military bases.
Great. Garrett, I'd like to welcome you back to the conversation and ask you to pose a question or two to Daniel.
Sure. And I'll remind our listeners that if you have a question for Daniel or for David, at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see the Q&A box. And we'll get to as many of those as we possibly can. There are already many interesting questions posed. And we'll follow up at the end with ways that you can contact us in case we weren't able to answer your question in the time that we have. Daniel, somebody who grew up in Canada noted that, as you said, the British Empire has an Empire Day, and they talk about the ways that a map of the British Empire is very much a part of British imperial pride. In fact, we have a map in our current exhibition that is so proud of the British Empire, they wrap around the world more than once. So there are 2 Australias in that map.
A victory lap.
Exactly, a victory lap. And so the question is, why didn't the United States ever sort of bring that into its mass culture, both the cartography of empire and this broader celebration of empire? And I want to add, you discuss this in the latter half of your book. Why is it that at exactly the time when the European colonial empires are in retreat around the middle of the 20th century, with the power of post-colonial movements pushing against them, why is it that the United States chooses to make this pointillist empire that you refer to? Instead of acquiring territory, it becomes after World War II, the United States has a powerful military, it emerges victorious from the Second World War, and instead of acquiring territory, it creates these 800 dots around the globe.
Yeah. Yeah, the question of why the United States doesn't come to look more like Britain or the Netherlands or Japan with regard to the forthright imperialism is an interesting one. And I mean, it might have to do with the just the sheer demographics. The U.S. mainland is huge, and so the relative demographic weight of the colonial empire is much less. I mean, it's a considerable empire, and at peak, it is the fourth largest empire, colonial empire in the world. But nevertheless, it's just nowhere compared to the population of the U.S. mainland. So that might be part of it. But I think it's rather that the United States is so committed to a Republican political identity and also so committed to a different kind of empire. So it's not like 1898 is suddenly a new moment of imperialism for the United States. There'd been a long history of and really violent history of dispossessing indigenous people that had been baked into U.S. political culture. People like Teddy Roosevelt were, extremely excited about it, had been celebrated. I mean, generations of people, even into the 20th century, are growing up playing cowboys and Indians and watching John Wayne movies and all that kind of stuff. So that aspect of empire is entirely visible in the United States. And I think it's partly because that's the model of empire, what scholars call settler colonialism, that it sort of crowds out this other form of, and this other understanding of empire. So it's my sense is it's the Republican political identity that the United States is able to kind of hang on to for itself as a fiction that it tells itself and that it tells the world, and also the fact that it still sees its main form of empire culturally as dispossessing Indians rather than ruling large distant colonized populations. What happens after World War II is interesting. So every major empire experiences some form of decolonization, whereby its large, anti-colonial movements seize their independence. And the United States does that in the case of the Philippines. Hawaii and Alaska seem like weird variant cases on that, but they're happening at the same time that, African nations are seizing independence. So it's chronologically the same. What's interesting is that the United States is gaining power at this time. Like Britain is losing power and losing territory. So that seems normal. The United States is gaining power, losing the Philippines, losing its sort of imperial identity in terms of large colonies that are publicly visible. And I think pointillism is a way to solve that problem, is a way for the United States to continue to have an extensive reach, to continue to have a territorial reach without bothering with large colonies. And in the book, I try to describe some technologies that the United States had mastered mainly during World War II that allowed it to dispense with large colonies to do the kinds of things that an empire might want to do and just focus on little dots. One of them, just to take an example, is aviation. So if you don't have aviation, in order to get from a locale to another locale safely, you need to control all of the land in between. And there's a lot of colonial projects where people are digging canals or building railways and trying to control the entire zone around them. Once you've got aviation, you can just hop from space to space, even if you're hopping over some, adversary's territory. And that allows the United States to just control the dots it wants to control without having to worry too much about the land around them or the people who live on that land.
There's something about this narrative and analysis, though, that I think is uncomfortable for some people, because there's a mythology about the purity of the American Republic, what becomes manifest destiny in another context, bringing democracy to the world. All of what you're sharing is counter narrative to that mythology. So yes, I guess is kind of what you're going to say to that in some ways.
It's true. I mean, I didn't set out, I think it's the thing that confuses this topic a lot is that, is the United States an empire or not? That's usually a question that people ask when they're asking, is the United States good or not? Do you like it or not? And so the people who dislike the United States say it's an empire, and the people who like it say, no, it's a republic, it's great. And that's not where I come from in the least. I mean, my interest here is not saying the United States is bad, and I've shown that because I've shown that it has overseas territories. If you were assembling a brief against the United States, you would probably look in other places. But it's that, the United States has been an empire this entire time, and that's really interesting. And in fact, you can't really grasp US history until you recognize this fact. We've been mismapping the country, and in some ways we've been mistelling the history. There are moments that one can take some, I guess, joy in or something. I mean, there's some happy stories here, and the successful decolonization of parts of the United States are part of that story. Those are not tragic moments. And the fact that the United States is able to not have a large colonial empire as Britain did when it was the world power, but have this pointillist empire instead, could be counted as a win if you're that's how you're scoring. My interest really isn't to kind of produce a kind of moral account of the country, but to produce an analytical and historical one.
And perhaps it could be both as well at the end of the day. Anyway, for better or worse. I'm hoping Garrett's going to ask you about some of the education questions that have come in, because I think this is a topic that we don't have in schools at this level of detail. But just before we go to that, Richard has asked about the Pearl Harbor narrative, and is it possible that this was narratively privileged because it was a military target, with actually most of the U.S. Pacific Fleet harbored there rather than other reasons?
Yeah, so another reason that I knew that Pearl Harbor was really important is that a lot of important ships in the U.S. fleet were taken out there. But it also turns out that the Japanese bombing of the Philippines a few hours later did enormous damage to the United States, to the largest collection of U.S. warplanes that were outside of the mainland. And so there's the official history of the World War II from the Army rates the Philippine attack as militarily just as damaging as the Hawaii attack. So I don't think that's the full answer.
Okay, great. Garrett, back to you.
One of the questions poses, you note that U.S. physicians went to the colonies, to Puerto Rico, to Philippines, oftentimes experimenting in rather immoral ways on colonial populations, and then came back to found institutions like Sloan Kettering and continue medical research. And it's not just physicians, it's urban planners and foresters and public health agents are kind of learning their professional skills on colonial subject populations. This question writer asks, what are the moral responsibilities of physicians who were embroiled in that colonial project, and more broadly, the professional classes that were going to administer these territories? How do we hold them to account for those kinds of actions?
I think we need to. So from the perspective of the mainland, the average person, living in Illinois might not think about Guam or the Philippines at all. I mean, it's quite easy from that, vantage to just not see the empire. But there is a class of people who find colonial careers, sometimes quick ones and sometimes quite long ones. And the reason is that, if you are a doctor or an architect or a lawyer or work in finance, these, as a banker, these overseas territories can be places where you can do things that you couldn't ordinarily do. And so, for example, Puerto Rico has a long history, and I think really tragic history, of being treated as a sort of medical experimentation laboratory. And in the book, I tell the story that you're alluding to of this doctor who goes to Puerto Rico with the Rockefeller Institute to experiment on anemia. And, he's trained at Harvard, and he arrives in San Juan, and he just becomes a different kind of doctor. And he thinks, oh, this is great. I'm surrounded by people who don't matter. And so he takes some people where he just refused to treat them just to see what happens. He tries to induce and does induce disease in others. And he writes a letter that gets found saying that he killed 8 of his patients on purpose, not just allowed them to die, but murdered them, and that he hates Puerto Ricans and that he's trying to transplant cancer into a few others. And that's absolutely staggering, but it's not just a bad apple here, partly because, he refers to incorrectly a sort of culture of disregard among the doctors, but also because the letter gets found out. He just leaves for New York. What happened in San Juan stays in San Juan. He's not fired. In fact, he goes on to be a leading figure in the New York medical scene and indeed the national medical scene, and has another episode where he does unconscionable experiments, mainly on Puerto Ricans, is also not impeded by that. And then, at the end of the day, is most famous for having been one of the fathers of chemotherapy, and for decades is remembered only for that. He's the director of the Sloan Kettering Institute. And this little sojourn he had in Puerto Rico just didn't really count in any way. So I think we're still reckoning with the legacy that a lot of people who appear as sort of heroic, bold thinkers in the United States and in the US mainland had moments in their career where they went to the colonies and acted with a kind of abandon because they felt like this was a place where they were basically unsupervised and were, couldn't be punished for any consequences of anything that happened. So I live in Chicago, a city that lauds a man who planned it and built parts of it, Daniel Burnham. But Daniel Burnham's legacy in the Philippines is quite different. He was less of a sort of architect than a kind of architectural imperialist, just imposing often quite disastrous designs on large parts of the urban Philippines and doing it without any democratic accountability.
Bill Maher always jokes that we do not need two Dakotas. How did this come about? And for that matter, we have two Carolinas.
Yeah, I don't really have a good story there. I think I don't have a sort of sinister story about the two Dakotas. Perhaps there is one. But moments like that are funny because they play with the map, right? Because you're like, maybe we don't have to have the map that we currently have. And at this point in 2020, it's hard for people in the United States to imagine, like, we feel like the map is the map, right? It's the country. And, there's the idea that you could split California into two or merge the Dakotas. It's a joke, right? You refer to a comedian making that joke. But, if you look at the past in US history, and especially if you look beyond the mainland, you see a lot of political dynamism and places becoming territories that weren't formally or becoming states or becoming independent. You see borders dancing across the Pacific and the Caribbean and the Arctic. And I think that's a reminder that, we don't have to be bound by the map as it is today, or at least as we think it is today. And one of the really exciting moments that, or the exciting aspects about the political moment that we're living in right now is that, it's a, really terrifying moment in a lot of ways, but it's also a moment of, when everything might be on the table. And one of the things on the table is, DC statehood, a binding vote on Puerto Rican status, which we've never had, that would allow Puerto Ricans to vote whether they would like to become a state, Commonwealth, independence. And there's actually a lot that could be done with the map that would give this country a different character.
Well, it materially affects the Electoral College, which is designed to protect a certain level of inclusion, but perhaps not what the distribution of the population is across individual states today.
Yeah, so we normally talk about the Electoral College as, for those who complain about it, usually complain that it gives you a very lumpy division, so that some of the electors represent a small number of people, some of them represent a very large number of people. That's unfair. And what we don't often say is that none of the electors represent the 3 million plus people who live in the U.S. overseas territories, and that's not just a fact today, but that's a fact throughout U.S. history dating until from 1898. So there's just this whole level of disenfranchisement that I think we just don't talk about it enough, and actually should be on the table.
Yep. Garrett?
Daniel, I know we have a lot of educators in the audience. Many have been posing interesting questions around the prompt that you began with, that, this sort of a story begins from ignorance, right? We're so often taught that this standard shape of the lower 48 states is the United States, and students aren't even invited to think beyond those borders. So what are the right ways to bring this into a curriculum in terms of history, geography, social studies? And then somebody else asked, like, what are the consequences of this ignorance, right? You refer to how for you it sparked the beginning of writing this book, but certainly for our broader politics, what by being ignorant of the United States overseas territories and its colonial past and present, how has that shaped what goes on in our politics and our relationship to the world today?
Yeah, yeah. The education question is a hard one, and I tried to write the book as accessibly as I could, and with the aim of not just saying, this is the history of the Philippines that I think it's very important you ought to know, but of saying this is how U.S. history changes once you understand that. So, kind of going through a lot of key moments in U.S. history, the Cold War, et cetera, and suggesting ways in which the narrative might change once we have mapped the country differently. But, you can't do it with a book or at least one book. And I'm certainly not the only one who's written a book in this vein. A few books won't do it. And the reason is that teachers don't have full discretion over what they teach in the classroom. They're also answerable to state standards, to standardized tests, and none of that really, I think, makes room for the full United States. It's usually just forces U.S. history into the narrow constraints of being the history of the U.S. mainland. So I think, like any change in how we think about the country's past, it takes quite a lot. It takes teachers in the classroom, it takes writers, it takes readers just to sort of, turn that 18-wheel truck around. But I think it does matter, to answer your second question. I think it's sort of tragic that what the people of the US mainland have failed to understand about their own country. And I'll give you two consequences. One is perhaps a more straightforward one. In 2017, a series of major hurricanes ripped through the Caribbean, and they did enormous damage to the U.S. Virgin Islands and to Puerto Rico. They hit Florida and Texas. And in terms of federal funding, in terms of news coverage, by any metric that charitable giving, any metric, the damage done to the U.S. mainland was just taken so much more seriously than the damage done to these U.S. territories. I was really inspired in writing this book by the language of Black Lives Matter, because it struck me that issue of mattering is precisely what's at stake in empire. Empire is a political system in which there's a core and periphery, and different kinds of rights apply in different kinds of places. And a simple way of saying that is it's a political system in which some places matter more than others, and in which some people matter more than others. And how long it took Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands to rebuild from the damage compared to what it looked like in Texas and Florida is just a clear and kind of heartbreaking metric of what it's like to be in a country where some places get resources and some places don't. The other example that I'd like to give is after September 11th, there was a very audible dialogue in the country, and George Bush phrased it like this: "Why do they hate us?" But just trying to explain what had happened, and the answer that Bush gave, and a lot of people gave, is, as Bush put it, they hate us because of our freedoms. Right? There's something about the character of the United States that is inimical to Al Qaeda and to Osama bin Laden, and we've been attacked because of our values. Osama bin Laden wrote a letter to the United States explaining his motives for the attack, and he actually wrote quite a lot over his lifetime. And the issue that mainly irritated him, that kind of started him on his jihad against the United States, and that served as a basis for a lot of his recruitment, was the fact that the United States had planted a military base, a very large military base in his country, Saudi Arabia, which is also the Holy Land containing both Mecca and Medina. And that military base, that sort of extension of the United States, was an enormous abrasion. It was like a kind of grain of sand in an oyster shell or something. It just produced like an enormous amount of hostility. And it was very frustrating that people in the United States couldn't really recognize that this had happened in part not just because of like who the United States is, its values, but also where the United States is. And it turns out that planning a military base in another country is an enormous imposition. Just imagine if China wanted to put a base in Texas. Like, imagine how well that would go down. And yet the United States has 800 of these bases today, and they kick up all kinds of resistance. But it's really hard for US voters to see that. And in fact, basing is almost never even something that political candidates talk about until the days of Trump, when again, everything is on the table.
You started to refer, I think, to China or as a possible. I mean, I'm I'm reminded of both the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then I'm also thinking of John's most recent question in the Q&A, which is, that modern empires include Russia's expansion or re-expansion, and China is actually building new islands out of the ocean to create new territory, not just take new territory. So this appears to be a modern phenomenon of the current great or some of the great powers. So are these the same? Are they different?
No, I mean, the pointillist pattern holds. It used to be the case that if you were a great power, you had a lot of colonies. Now, if you are a major power, you have military bases. But let's talk about scale. Yeah. China is building up a presence on these artificial islands. So it is making islands so that it can have a presence on them and so they can be bases. But if we're talking about foreign bases, so that bases are in some foreign country, China's total basing network, if you add it all up, it's one base in Djibouti. And if you add up every foreign base that every country other than the United States has, you're looking at a number like 40. The United States has 800. We are looking at a massive, disproportionate size of the basing networks. I'm glad I just want to do a little riff. I'm glad you mentioned the Cuban Missile Crisis. There was another thing that I learned that I was like teaching wrong or talking about wrong. The Cuban Missile Crisis is the near Armageddon that ensues when Russia opens, or Soviet Union opens military bases on Cuba and stations armed missiles there. And then there's almost a nuclear war over it. The Kennedy at one point during this says, this is intolerable. It's as if we open military bases in Turkey and put ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles there. And his national security advisor says, we did do that. You did that. You understand you did that? And he's like, oh, I didn't know. And it turns out that like when you get Khrushchev's side of why the Cuban Missile Crisis was happening, for him, it was a Turkish missile crisis. He was like, I can't believe they put missiles in Turkey. We're going to put them in Cuba so they know what it's like to have bases nearby and how scary that is. So, I mean, this is the kind of like, you can't smell yourself of US foreign policy is like they're like almost go to nuclear war over the Cuban missile bases, but don't even remember, Kennedy doesn't even remember that he put the Turkish bases in there. And I think that's kind of what happens when you have this incredibly large basing network. You almost don't notice the effect that it has on other parts of the world and how dangerous that effect can be.
I'll turn it back to Garrett again after this one, but the follow-up question from another John, and I love doing this with historians, is asking what would be the right next move? What is the future for the U.S. with regard to its presence in the world, which, as we've been talking about, has this enormous presence all over physical presence all over the globe?
So I think there are two things that strike me as easy. One is binding status votes in the territories. The status of U.S. overseas territories should be determined not as it has always been determined by Congress, but by the people who live in them. I mean, that's just a fundamental sort of democratic principle. And it's not totally obvious how all of these places would vote. But nevertheless, it should be up to territorial inhabitants to determine their political relationship to the United States. The other thing is that I think we really need to talk about contracting the basing network. The bases are incredibly expensive just to maintain. They are also expensive in the hostility that they kick up. There are a lot of sort of foreign entanglements, unnecessary ones that the United States gets into because of the bases. They're enormously unpopular worldwide. I mean, it's complicated and we can talk about the complexities, but by and large, they do not make friends for the United States. And I don't even think they're necessary, even in the sort of most vigorous understanding of what US foreign policy requires.
Garrett.
Daniel, someone writes in appreciating the way that you talk about the role of technology in shaping the spatial dimensions of empire. You mentioned aerial travel and aerial warfare already in the talk, but the book is full of descriptions of supply chains and radar and all of these kind of space-destroying technologies. And this question asks, what is going to happen now that we have the ultimate space-destroying technology of the internet? And it's a question that's appropriate for today, since you're in Chicago, we're in Boston. We have viewers from perhaps all around the world, in and outside of the proper borders of the United States, in an era when the internet can disrupt politics, when it can be used for warfare, for disinformation? How does that affect the kind of global projection of sovereignty and of a new kind of empire?
Yeah, it matters a lot is the answer. It's hard to remember what this is like, but it used to be the case that if you wanted to securely communicate from point A to B, you had to run a cable. And if that cable ran through your enemy's territory, they could cut it, or they could listen in to what you were saying on it. So a lot of, for example, the British Empire is concerned with generating something that the British imperialists called an all red map. So a map where all the British cables were securely protected by British territory. There was no interruption. The British cable never had to pass onto non-British territory. And in fact, the British were able to get a sort of cable network that went all the way around the world, only touching British territory as it did. So the United States, after World War II, developed radio as a way of dealing with that problem. And that allows you to have disconnected bases rather than contiguous territories. But even still, it was kind of important to have places all over the planet where you could set down your transceivers, where you could beam information. A lot of the Cold War was fought by the United States by trying to shred the informational sovereignty of Cuba and the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc by just beaming messages into them, messages that were hostile to the ruling regimes. Ever since we've had satellites, though, there's no spatial logic to communication. You don't have to have any spot of land anywhere in order to get a message somewhere. And I think that actually changes geopolitics in sort of erasing geopolitics. It means that location matters less. And in my book, I describe this process whereby control of land matters less and less. And that's why you get a transition from a colonial style of empire to a pointillist style. But it's going to keep mattering less in communication and transportation, all kinds of ways planes go further, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's another reason to hope that we might be looking at a political future where control over land is less important and where any kind of empire, either pointillist or colonial, is really unnecessary, obsolete almost.
Eric asks, and this is about the Native American and indigenous tribal reservations and their role in the modern interpretation, really, of statehood and this arrangement of power within what it means to be the United States. So, how does the modern interpretation of Native American indigenous tribal reservations that have sovereignty play into possible efforts to seek statehood? Perhaps similar to the failed attempt that was part of Oklahoma. I think there's probably several directions you could take this question in. I'll leave it to you to tell us how this plays out within this empire.
One way of noting that the United States is an empire, i.e., a polity with a differentiated and hierarchically differentiated political spaces, is not just to note the presence of overseas territories like the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, the US Virgin Islands, American Samoa, et cetera. It's also to notice that within the states, there is quite a lot of land that is reserved for tribal nations. And in fact, within the United States, there are, I believe this number is right, 573 tribal nations. There are, this is not just like, wall-to-wall carpeting of states with just a little bit of Indian reservation. There's quite a lot of, that's federally recognized tribal nations. And there's quite a lot of lands that is not just used by and claimed by tribal nations, but therefore has a kind of different legal arrangement. That's why you can have, casinos, for example, on some lands within states that otherwise prohibit casinos from operating. And where this is going to go is hard to say. I think it would be hard to imagine that the reservation system would resolve into statehood, because that would be a carve out from existing states. So it wouldn't look like a place that hadn't been a state, like Alaska becoming a state, a territory becoming a state. It would rather look like Virginia becoming Virginia and West Virginia. So it would involve taking land away from existing states. And for that reason, it might be more difficult. And it's also politically still hard to imagine a lot of enthusiasm from Washington for an all Indian state. In the book, I talk about great attempts in the 19th century to create all Indian states and just getting shot down over and over again. It'd be very interesting if politically we're at that moment where that would be tolerable to Washington. I'm not sure that we are.
And there's was one question in the pre-submitted questions and one tonight about lunar expansion. I mean, so you do, I believe, mention this somewhere in the book, at least in passing. So there is another frontier out there, serious or not.
It's serious and not. So one thing you have to realize is that when the United States can first go to the moon, a lot of people think that this is going to be valuable territory. So when I say a lot of people, I do not just mean science fiction writers. I mean people at NASA. There are plans generated to colonize the moon. Physicists are part of those plans. They are happening within the auspices of NASA, and they're sort of doing exercises. How long would it have to take? And they come up with this view that actually the way to colonize space is you use the moon, but you don't really colonize the moon. You have a kind of rotating space station near the moon, whatever. They have it all worked out. And so in the 60s and 70s, it really seems like space colonization is a graspable future. So that is a sense in which, lunar travel is quite serious. There's also a sense in which it's not serious, or at least it's not serious as empire, which is this. The United States never claims the moon. The United States is the only country that can get to the moon for quite some time, and it doesn't claim the moon, despite no rival preventing it, despite no indigenous population. And in fact, that is a measure of how successful anti-colonial movements were, that by 1969, there are discussions about whether the United States should territorially claim the moon, but the allergy to empire has grown so large that basically the US decides that it's not going to try to antagonize the many opponents of empire worldwide by trying to claim this unclaimed land. And so it goes up. There's even a debate about whether the US flag should be planted. They talk about maybe it would be more appropriate to plant the UN flag. So they end up planting the US flag, issuing a pronouncement saying, just so it's clear, we are not claiming, that's not a claim, that's just that we're proud, we're happy to have a flag. They put a plaque there that barely mentions the United States. We came from Earth. This is an Earthling achievement, not an American achievement. And I mean, from the 19th century perspective, it's completely pathetic, right? Like, in the 19th century, they would have claimed the moon. And so it's quite interesting that the legitimacy of empire has rightly declined to the point where even lunar colonization is seen to be politically feasible, or sort of materially feasible, but politically dodgy.
We're getting close to time, so I think we'll give Garrett one more question, and if we're not right at time, I'll throw one more in. Garrett, over to you.
Sure. There's a question, Daniel, that I think sums up in many ways the spirit of a lot of questions, which is that your book seems like a quite powerful counter argument to the idea that the world is flat, famously proposed by Thomas Friedman. Even within the boundaries of the US, it's bumpy with varied rights, and where you are determines a lot about what legal protections you enjoy. So if you're in Saipan or Washington, DC, or a tribal reservation, what you get looks different from if you're in a major metropolitan area or somewhere else. And we're all increasingly familiar in important ways of the importance of race, class, and gender, and shaping struggles for justice. But I was wondering, can you elaborate on the where question? How people's geography still plays a role in who gets what, who has power, and who's far from power?
Yeah. Garrett, I think you said that very well, so I will just be repeating back in some ways what you've said, but you're right that we often frame political questions as questions of who gets what, right? Lenin said that every political question is basically whom, who is the actor and who is acted upon. And once you figured that out, you've gotten to the bottom of it. But that doesn't get you all the way there. And in fact, place matters quite a lot in politics. It matters for formal political reasons because we are still not in a world entirely of nation states. But even if we were in a world of nation states with no military bases, which nation state people were in would be enormously important. I was shocked to learn from development economists, and I've had this verified multiple times. I had to have it verified multiple times because it was so surprising to me. Your economic fortunes as a human on Earth are more determined, are not most determined by who your parents are, your education level, they are most determined by what country you were born in. That is the single largest determinant, and larger than the wealth of your parents into your future economic earnings and your life expectancy and that kind of thing. And that's just a way to remind ourselves that, yeah, it can feel, especially, you know, we've got the internet, you know, the world can watch Netflix. We feel that we're kind of in a global village, but we're really not. And place matters quite a lot. And it's going to continue to matter as global warming heats up. We've already seen this within the United States. Certain places like Puerto Rico and the U.S. and islands, Marianas, are way more vulnerable to global warming than parts of the U.S. mainland. And that's true globally as well. We're going to be reminded in, I think, a quite painful and scary way in the next couple of years that place matters, and it hasn't stopped mattering.
No, just quickly, you towards the end of the book, you talk about we are in a presidential election season right now, and you talked about some recent candidates, and including John McCain and Sarah Palin and a couple of others who had some of these territories or statehood questions turned out differently, might materially have affected certain candidates' eligibility for running for president.
Yeah. I won't drag you through all the details. They really are delicious. They're in the book. That's my advertisement for buying the book. But it turns out that the 2008 election, which is kind of the moment when everything, you know, that we're currently politically living with sprang forth, is totally marked by empire. John McCain was born in the Panama Canal Zone, and that has serious implications for arguably his eligibility for the presidency at all. Sarah Palin was from Alaska, married to an Alaska native who was a member of the Alaska Independence Party. Barack Obama was born in Hawaii right after it became a state. And the fact that he was born in Polynesia played a major role in understandings of him as foreign, both from people within Hillary Clinton's camp, but then later from the Republican side. And I'll just remind you that the concern that Barack Obama is foreign, that was the entry point for Donald Trump into major presidential politics. That was the issue that got him the spotlight. And that was the issue that he rode into a successful presidential run. So in many ways, we are still living with the consequences of the fact that the United States is not just a collection of states. The United States is and has been for its entire history, states and territories, i.e. an empire.
Daniel, thank you so much for the conversation tonight. This was a very educational and I think entertaining conversation. To those of you, I think over 70 questions were submitted tonight and at the start of the topic, start of the program. So we did our best between Garrett and I to blend a few together and make sure we got them into the conversation. Our apologies to those of you who we didn't get to your question. So once again, Daniel, thank you. To our friends at the Leventhal Map and Education Center, Garrett Dash Nelson and the team, but also thanks to the Lowell Institute, to the GBH Forum Network, and the great staff here at the Boston Public Library, and our friends at Trident Bookseller. So once again, thank you all for joining us. Until next time, please be well, please be safe.